Hi. Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome back. My name's Stephen Best. I'm director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities. We're really excited to host another round of book chats this semester. We're pleased to host Todd Olson, professor of early modern art in the Department of Art History here at Berkeley. Todd is the author of Poussin and France, Painting, Humanism, and the Politics of Style from 2002, Caravaggio's Pitiful Relics from 2014, and he joins us today to discuss his latest book, Ribera's Repetitions, Paper and Canvas in 17th Century Spanish, Naples. In conversation with Todd is our colleague Niklas Largier, the Sydney and Margaret Anker Professor of German and Comparative Literature, former chair of comparative literature, now relieved of the students. I'm sure he's so happy about that. Before I turn things over to Todd and Niklas, I wanted to just draw your attention to a few things happening in coming weeks. In early October, we're pleased to host the psychoanalyst Avgi Sakatopoulou as our Avenali lecturer. The lecturer, Fighting Fire with Fire, Aesthetics, Exigent Sadism, Insurgency, will take place on Monday, October 6th, over in Wheeler Hall in the Mod 5 room. And the following day, October 7th, Sakatopoulou will be in conversation with our colleagues Damon Young from French and Film and Media, and Paola Bacchetta and Eric Stanley, both of Gender and Women's Studies. Our next book chat will take place on Wednesday, September 17th, when we'll be joined by Claire Kahane, Professor Emerita at the University of Buffalo and a visiting scholar in the Department of English. Claire will be here to discuss her recent memoir, 9 Lives, My Risky Road from 50s Rebel to Feminist Critic. Claire will be joined by Elizabeth Abel, Professor Emerita in the English Department. Todd, we regret that we had to cancel your book chat last March on account of some protest, as I recall. It was the season of protest. But we're very glad we could find a place for you at the top of our fall roster. So we look forward to hearing you on Ribera. Thanks.
Thank you. Cool. I guess it's sorry, it's my task to start with the chat or the conversation here. Just to point out, there are a few chairs here, like 3 or 4 spots are free here. And I just want to start by thanking you for inviting me to be in conversation with you about this really wonderful book, which made me discover a lot. As you can see here, I also have it here. We could also let one circulate if, yeah.
It's also available.
Just give it back to me.
Store.
Give it back to me.
There it is.
At the end, it's a book about Jusepe de Ribera for 1591 to 1652. Giuseppe de Ribera is from near Valencia, worked in Spanish Viceregal Naples. So let's just start with a few kind of points to orient ourselves. He worked in Naples, where he was known as Lo Spagnoletto, the Little Spaniard. And with his book, or with this book, you revisit the early modern moment and some of the challenges, we could say, of the image that are also at the center of your book on Caravaggio. And at some point while I was reading the book, I also thought, what's the relation between these two, or what's the relation between the styles? Is the mic okay, or is there some kind of, or do I just hear some kind of weird hallucination? As the title, you see here, the book, the title of the book indicates, there are like 3 key emphases that are interwoven throughout the book. What you call Ribera's obsession with repetition, something really fascinating when you look at it and you start out with it as an observation that somewhat came about when you looked at catalog or even pictures on the web, that there's this moment of repetition, can be what you call an obsession, compulsion, repetition, compulsion. as material processes of inscription, you also call it. And then we have a second aspect that also comes about in the title, that is paper and canvas, repetitions, paper and canvas. That is an emphasis on material and media, which are very important to you. And then the third moment, 17th century Naples, a place that is the location of both new scientific communities between Rome and Naples, where Ribera negotiates his place at that time. And it is a Spanish viceregal domain, but at the same time, it is part of a global empire and colonial administration. And what I learned, I wasn't aware of that as much as you make the reader aware of it, is that Jesuit missionaries and colonial administrators regularly referred to southern Italy also as Otras Indias, in a global empire, the global Spanish Empire, that extends from the Philippines to southern India. He also mentioned that, I quote, there was not a clear conceptual or representational distinction between Naples and the Americas or Asia. So Naples turns into a really fascinating, kind of unique place of negotiation that happens, colonial negotiation that actually happens in Southern Europe in relation to all these empire places that constitute at that point the Spanish Empire. So what makes your book deeply fascinating, I found, is how you locate Ribera within these multiple crossroads. And he really emerges as somebody who, you could say, is a visual thinker who thinks through these relations in the media of drawing, of painting, and so on. And that's what emerges from the book. And in emphasizing this, I just want to draw attention again to the triangulation that draws attention on one side to Ribera's technical painterly or stylistic aspect, so with repetition, kind of morphological commitments, experimentation with forms, but also experimentation with the material aspects, etching, printmaking, seriality. All this plays a key role for you. Then the dialogue between this and commitments or interests in the cultures of learning in Rome and Naples, and the material spheres of circulation in the Spanish Empire and colonial world. But you never let go of the basic perspective that Ribera opens up for you and for us or for the reader, namely the deep engagement with the formal acts of drawing, etching, inscribing, patterning, contorting. It's once you start following these lines, the reader gets deeply enmeshed, you could say, in that kind of material imagination that seems to me is so important for Ribera. Acts that turn into gestures that register all these lines of engagement that you foreground. Thus, what emerges for me through your work, and I won't talk that long on, we'll turn to a few points that I find most interesting, but what emerges is a deep analysis that starts with the work of etching, really with the work of the kind of the gesture, the investment in the technique, the needle and the material in the studio, and extends from there through circles that illustrate the artist's agency, his investments, sensibilities, to the ways in which the work reflects on and intervenes in all that surrounds it. So this is all fairly general still, and I asked myself, so where should we start when it's meant to be a chat? And I thought, maybe the first observation, this what you call obsessive repetition, seriality in Ribera's style throughout his life. You follow it from the beginning. It's always something that is there. And then the material in the studio. And so what we could talk about, you start with this picture. This is figure 1 in the book. So the reader opens that picture. And there is an emphasis on the fact that painting, you call it once, is materially constituted. Yeah, we all know that. So on one side, a craft is being foregrounded, but on the other side, then it is an intense evocation of material presence that you are trying to bring to our attention, and that you then also put into a dialogue with new empiricism, or with the empiricism that comes about at that time, and that is also at stake in conversations, in learned circles, as you show in Rome and in Naples at the time. So I just wondered, why did you choose this as figure 1? That's kind of as the entry point for the reader's imagination, so to speak.
It's funny, the image I selected was this, but it emphasized the kind of cincturing of the arm as a point of departure. And I thought I was thinking, again, I have to thank Nicholas during COVID, and I was in my world, as we all were. Nicholas was one of my interlocutors, major, but in his book form. So his book on the whip was kind of really important for that chapter, and thinking through some of the problems with asceticism. And so part of the selection of the Sebastian, a series of pictures that I took details in person. And one of the things I wanted to invoke was the ways in which, and we're talking about materiality and thinking about artist agency. And one of my interlocutors who's passed is Gell on artists and agency, and thinking about distributed self, thinking about the self as constituted through the making and the dispersal of things. So that was important for thinking about the link between this kind of painting and the painting and the etching process, as you brought up. So one thing led, they mutually inform each other. And that's what I was thinking about, how certain kinds of activities in the artist studio, such as etching, can be transposed to other practices, like domain shift from drawing and specifically in etching. One of the way I started thinking about, again, these details, kind of invoke it, is with the particular kind of, I was interested in the work of Ribera as the way that he could use a dry brush that is that would excavate rather than just apply paint. Like excavation, and at the same time apply paint and infuse it in that excavation. So that kind of technical, the craft language, right? The craft language, the moment you utter it, it takes on an allegorical function, or it takes on a descriptive function that exceeds these processes. And that's where etching comes in for me too, is it's always been a vehicle for that, the most technical, divorced, agentless language is the most fertile in terms of exploring deep fundamental emotions.
And so I've gotten more fascinated in this way on myself over the last couple of years, because we always make that distinction. There's the craft aspect, the craftsman, and then there's the artist. Yeah. And you in bringing or in drawing attention to this kind of dialogue between painterly and etching, craft, you foreground something that in the craft actually is more important, or that we should pay more attention to.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I mean, it's an old habit from being a old social art historian to do the best kind of formal analysis, and not to be thinking of just a theorist or whatever. And so that kind of integrity of the description it's always been foregrounded. But again, with that language, the kind of formal language or the craft language, the kind of instrumental language, points to ways that the artist is not in full control of the resources, that there's a deferral of agency to the process. And so the process kicks back at, the object kicks back at the artist in terms of the constitution of self.
And Ribera seems to take on a very particular position here. This, I guess, it's also a Saint Sebastian, yes.
Saint Sebastian is the very first etching. He's like doodling around, and that's the process of etching. It's very immediate. It says there's a contradiction. It's very immediate, but then there's a lot of relinquishment of control over the process. So what you see is reversed. What you put under the blanket is not revealed until it's outside. And for Ribera, in terms of the imagination, the material imagination of the artist is Caravaggio never drew. He just painted, he applied paint made the composition on the canvas. Ribera was trained in drawing or working with drawing, but etching itself becomes a reservoir for him throughout his life. So I like to imagine that this drawing, this etching is like floating around in the studio, just the same way a sketch would or a preparatory drawing would. And that's important toward in the last chapter where it's like 40 years later, these imagery emerges, but the imagery isn't just in his head, it's right there on this inked up, disabused piece of paper.
What you just said when you made that comparison with Caravaggio, I was thinking about Caravaggio at moments in there, and I didn't know that Caravaggio didn't draw or didn't experiment with etching in that way. And you draw from that, kind of looking at that, since we're here at the moment, and you draw lines that go then from Ribera kind of into the philosophical conversations with Lucretius, materialism, etc., which is important for him without him actually explicitly commenting on it. And then on the
that's
other
that aspect of being an organic intellectual, being not laying a kind of peintre philosophe onto him. And so the conditions of his thinking, as you said, a kind of pictorial thinking, but it's also a non-thinking, right? I mean, it's like when people, when he's doing this kind of activity, right, on the right, and it's related, of course, to kind of print technologies, but historians of science will tell us that, it's the birth of the collection, right? And Naples is the birth of the scientific, so-called natural philosophy collection. And so I work with that in terms of its, the implications and the imperial implications, the kinds of generation of drawings and prints from New Spain, for instance, or the colonial world of Spain. But he's also kind of, his face is in the paper, right? And the face in the paper is doing other kinds of activities than, let's say, just sorting or taxonomies.
I get that. I'm still, I want to somehow move you down to you use that term, and people who have been in my seminars, my obsession with imagination is somewhat obsessive, as the word said. That material investment I find so fascinating, that you see in his work. namely as when you jumped now to kind of something I had kind of at the end here, so I have to reorganize my thought.
Okay.
The thinking in images,
Right.
or the kind of that when we say imagination in that context, and that's been something for me always fascinatingly irritating in early modernity. In the larger context. When you think about Rabelais, and just to take another example where I became aware of it when I taught that seminar with
Why you picked Rabelais?
Yes, very good. That's why.
Rabelais.
Yes,
You went straight to this.
and with about Rabelais and the grotesque, and then at some point how I became aware of that deep investment of working with words. In that now in the Lamennais, Rabelais, he doesn't paint, so he works with words, and it is this when the imagination kind of delves into, you could say, the world of words.
Yeah.
And in a similar way,
printed
it seems
words,
to
though,
me,
right?
it is
printed words.
Printed
Key
words. Okay, so that's another kind of a media aspect that you also make important, especially with the etchings and the seriality, which are not just repetition; it's always repetition, variation, etc. But so you also you just brought up this picture when we think about early modern representation of senses. Seems to be it's a big topic, and all of you, I think, or most of you know these. I wrote them in like Bruegel the Elder, Rubens, etc. They have these big allegorical paintings of the senses. And Ribera is not the only one, but he does it very prominently, that he seems to pull it, to say it in that way, pull it down into a very concrete, you could say, still life-like, working with these elements, moment of, when I wrote for myself, kind of dirty and the dirty sphere of everydayness. So for example, in that, sorry to say it, no, but now
you're getting personal.
Nothing judgmental about that. I mean it entirely positively, as we So and again the dialogue, or what you enter into is on one side the formal experimentation that we just saw before with that Sebastian, which is not really a representation, an illustration of Sebastian. When you look at it, you get pulled into this very concrete, repetitive moment of either drawing or in the etching. And similarly here, and which brings us then also to the craft and the experimentation with the craft, and similarly here, from the big allegorical representation of senses, when you think about Bruegel, I have before my inner eye of taste, for example, which has all these narrative elements and allusions and so on, all that falls away and brings this before our eyes. Maybe you want to say something about that kind of revision of.
I think your displeasure with kind of imagination as image, as a priori to the thing, right, is, it's the way we tend to say image instead of picture, for instance, the specificity of medium. And what that does is it sets up a priori, this kind of inside the head, the idea. It's like Panofsky, the idea, rather than the kind of coming out of this craft mentality. These pictures, again, though, these are the ones you turn to, right, to the Rabelais-esque, is the sense that this is a connection to Caravaggio too, as this what I call the kind of slumming measure, movement. The slumming movement is kind of thinking in terms of the compression of a realistic effect and lowness, so that enjoyment, and that's Rabelais. Rabelais is jumping up and down in terms of the kind of intellectual registers.
Yeah.
But and you brought up, and you also just brought up, we went back to the Sebastian. And the Sebastian is a good case in terms of, we saw that gorgeous detail. And the detail is indicative of that like a hair follicle is coterminous with a brushstroke. In other words, there's a equivalency, and the artist is drawn to certain kinds of textural effects that are collapsing into the quality of the brushstroke. So the brushstroke isn't standing in necessarily for something else. It is what it is. You know, it's there, co-present with what it is representing. And so the thematics of the compression and the kind of asceticism comes out of, again, what it is to meditate on immersion of a plate into acid, which is etching, as distinct from engraving. What it is to create a plate that is susceptible and hostage to the acid, that immersive, the mordant bath.
Yeah.
And that's when forget about the control. There's a whole section I talk about foul biting. So foul biting is when the acid drips across the plate accidentally. So this, again, there's a distance between the precondition of the imagination and the imagination taking place on that surface. As and you know, the evidence is he kept the accident. You know, he kept the cuts through the plate that occur from the acid. And this is Jerome, right?
Yes.
This is,
so that when you draw attention to that, I think there are two more things. Time obviously is going very fast, and we should open it. But there are two more important things. I think that you just drew a line now to the ascetic, or the fascination with the ascetic side, and I find it's at first a kind of a paradox, that you make us aware of, that the aesthetic gesture doesn't lead into an idealization or an ideal kind of leaving of the material, but it brings him as artist kind of deeply into the material flow, to put it that, so that he even accepts the mistakes that happen that the accidental aspects of the production, of the etching, of the work, of the craft, etc., and that the craft always is involved in that flow. And so for you, it's in the Hieronymus etchings and in the contortions. As a painter, I found that more than many painters seem to be early modern, particularly interested very much in contortion, always of bodies. That seems to be a really important thing for him, and not just as what one could say kind of anatomical studies. Obviously, it's more interesting to see bodies like that than just standing around. And I would say, but to be,
that's getting personal again.
But he's all into that.
Yeah.
And so that's one side. Maybe you just want to say a few sentences, and then the other is that.
Can I go back to what you did? Which again, this chapter is in deep conversation with you. And so when I was thinking about that basic contradiction, it's like brilliant realization is all this work, self-disciplining, self-harming in order to eradicate the material. And yet it's a repetition, recapitulation of the, it's like the most material you can get, right? So I think there's in terms of, again, I'm showing you the acid, the acid flow, and that sense of.
So it's these two streaks.
Yeah, the two streaks.
The two lines. That's the acid that just.
And I hesitate to say accidental because that's a modern construct, chance. So pre-chance intervention. There's some intervention on a material level that's taking place through the process. And he relinquishes control of it, and then he distributes this. He's willing to like build that into the image. I mean, there's a connection with Caravaggio, which is the connection to thinking about an artist that anticipates the decline, dispersal, the degradation of the image in time. So that's part of the aesthetic, is not to think of, to imagine Jerome is not to imagine an arrested moment.
Yeah.
You know, it's revealing that kind of process.
It's also a tension. I mean, Jerome is the kind of the archetype of the writer, translator, and then now you get the books falling apart, and the translation into the image.
Yeah.
But then the image again, if you now take it seriously, the image itself as something that in its movement, in its production, is exposed to decay, or would you read it along that line?
There's Jerome in his study, which is a translator, safely in his study, thinking about his life in the desert, right?
Yeah.
He's writing those letters and talking about the desert, and he's reflecting on that experience. And so this is a compression of that. It's almost like a memory image of Jerome's kind of aesthetic practice.
So now you have to say, because we have a little bit left, we should open up for questions in a moment. But so, because we haven't talked about the colonial imperial aspect, and what is, I think, also significant is that from this, what I would also call, vulnerability that is so central to Ribera.
Yeah.
There's like through this is Bartholomew, is that correct? Yes. And then the colonial distribution of this, or the way in which, and Bartholomew is whatever is rebelling against the idol makers, and then is being flayed, I think, or skinned.
Yeah, so this.
And there is but it's not the only case. There's many lines but maybe just to talk about this for a moment before we open the floor. How that Naples kind of Spanish Empire circulation is there in that figure of Ribera as the artist beyond the studio, or always interacting.
Are always in the studio imagining the outside, that imaginary world. And part of that is, again, the first two chapters are about the kind of scientific, as you say, the new empiricism. And I try to really link that. There's a strange way in 17th century studies, we talk about the Barberini circle, and they produce the Rerum Mexicanorum. It's a book that's based on Philip II's scientific project in New Spain. So there's that concrete connection. I did kind of develop that concrete connection in the latter imagery, and the last chapter is very much my first publication on it, thinking about, again, the Otras Indias and the transmission, and Bartholomew as a shifter. He's a shifter because, according to Guaman Poma, Bartholomew precedes, he's an apostle like Thomas who goes to Mexico and converts people prior to the missionaries, so prior to colonialism. Yeah. So it's like always already colonized, and that's part of the Bartholomew. And Bartholomew is also a piece of skin that floats in the ocean from South Asia, according to some legends, to Lipari outside of Italy. So it's the Bartholomew works in multiple ways as both this shifting figure, and ultimately, what occurs in his work, and this is where when I first wrote this, I put A to B was the talking about the print and then the subsequent drawing in the Morgan on the left.
Mhm.
And what I did is I reversed that. So that last chapter begins with this as a kind of retrospective examination of his life shortly before his death, shortly after the revolt of Naples, this moment in which he repeats and re-examines and explores the imagery on the right. So again, as I say, this colonial imaginary is about the shifting between, and I mean, the very first part of the book is about here's an artist that signs his name not only as Spagnoletto, but he identifies as Hispanic. He identifies as from Naples. He's constantly shifting the identity of himself in the production.
But do you read it? And that's my last question. But is it? Do you see him as registering a colonial violence that goes through all these moments? I mean, it is a very, not just here, I mean, the violence is there all the time.
Right, right.
You don't have to answer that.
Uh,
I mean, it
I mean-
comes about. I mean, I don't want to kind of save him in any way, but just as that presence, also with the way you draw attention and describe it, the practice of etching and how that. I mean, I don't know anything about it. The very craft, etc. But it seems important to you in that book, without fully being kind of put out there.
Right, without being reflection of
Yeah.
said violence.
Yeah.
And that's the importance of the language, which is a language is embedded in a language of violence.
Yeah.
But the violence isn't person against person, it's the material plate, these kind of substances working out.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I invite you to read it and thinking about, a part of the world here, is the way that what institutes the revolt of Cairo. I mean, sorry. The revolt of Naples is instituted by a bunch of, talking about Rabelais, there's a ritual of moriscos against Christians, and it takes place throughout the world. And a bunch of Neapolitan children dress up in blackface, and they attack the Christians, and they throw fruit at each other. The fruit there's no fruit around, so it instigates a rebellion and then a subsequent revolt. So the instituted in this image, I think that's what I try to argue, is the relationship of this kind of shifting identities of Otras Indias to this kind of, So I know we have to run out of time, but that's the invitation.
Okay.
Thank
now
you.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah.
They didn't have fruit, so what did they threw stones, and that's why it escalated into rebellion? I just wanted the end of that thought.
What happened is there was a taxation on fruit, so that the vendors would not supply fruit, and then it turned against the viceroy. So again, they turned it against the Spanish authority.
Okay, thank you. I really want you to talk about all the violence that Nicholas has brought up, and those male bodies and the rotation that you talk about. If you could just speak to that some more, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a lot of resistance among Neapolitan scholars to cast him as inherently violent individual. There's a whole biographical, because in the 17th century, in 18th century, they laid it on Ribera as an inherently violent individual. So I don't want to go that far in terms of, go the other direction. I think the rotational figures, the ones like those I see those as imbricated in colonial violence in the sense that they were produce for the king, they come out of a reference to Titian and the production of images for Charles V and deep into the Spanish Empire. And part of that argument is, here is what happened to you when you revolt. So those images come out as specifically anti-liberation movement or anti-Protestantism or so I would say that, and I talk about this, that's kind of the legacy of those images. I mean, the legacy of the images gets diverted because suddenly people are thinking that it's just affecting women's pregnancies and screwing up their pregnancies. That's what the literature turns it into. But the root cause of these images is, this is what happens to traitors. They go to hell and they get devoured for eternity, right? So it's that kind of value.
And I just wanted to draw another line as well. In that strong reception of its metamorphoses, which really in early modernity is an important background always, I find.
Right.
There is also, it's always violent. There's a very strong element on one side, transformation of form, openness to movement, openness to that kind of imminent forces of force. But at the same time, it's all about violence. When you read these stories, so and that's very present, and I think it's all present here too. In addition to that, but actually,
The person being flayed alive. So
and it gets mixed up.
That's the foundational.
How do you see it? It gets also. This is obviously a saint, etc. So you have that Christian hagiography, which has that strong violence element, always, martyrdom, etc. And then the metamorphosis tradition, which is slightly different. But I see also there is that totally, I speculate, as it kind of comes together in the material work.
Right?
Yeah.
It's slow violence.
Yeah, but if you
right?
get slow.
The rotation, it's the repetition of the eagle or vulture who's devouring the liver, and then it keeps on repeating itself. So it built into that structurally. There's very little room for a clear narrative of someone hitting someone else over the head. It's internalized to the body, and that's where the composition comes in. I talk about the acid, but the composition is about confinement. There's the John Hartman poster of the crucified person on the swastika, and that's like a brilliant citation of a medieval someone falling through boundless, no fulcrum. Right. So the fulcrums are the edge of the canvas or the format.
Sorry. I don't know your name. Sorry.
Thank you. Just tagging into the violence conversation, and this is kind of a half-baked thought, but wouldn't the repetition of style suggest more of like an affirmation of the status quo rather than a rebellion to it? And I'm thinking a lot about the Guamampoma images that you shared, just because it made me think of how much violence is in that chronicle, very explicit violence that recurs to a very innovative style and technique of drawing and printing.
Right.
And I'm just wondering about how you deal with that. On the one hand, there's like a consistency of style that might be less, I guess, rebellious in a way. And the other side of the Atlantic, I don't know, I know it's like a big question, but
Great question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Guamapomo's chronicle, right, is he's imagining he's making prints, but hand prints, right? He's creating a book for the king, Philip II. So he's creating this kind of legacy. Now, the thing about the Bartholomew in that particular text, right, is that after all the conquistadors who are punishing people, all the violence, colonial violence that he's very explicit about. It's like the Bartholomew imagery is about the validation of a pre-Christian Christian and his kind of genealogy, right? So it occupies an odd space because it's him, Guaman, saying to the king, "We're one of you." It's the declaration, and then we have the whole lineage system, and then shit hits the fan, and there's the whipping, then the punishment. So that's the odd thing. Is the imagery creating ballast for this roller coaster shipwreck that's happening, or is it reproducing the violence, right? So that's always, that's the great question, right? We know that in teaching, right? Are we reproducing the violence, and just talking about it, right? Recapitulating it. And so that's kind of the dilemma that's caught, that maybe we can see that, I don't know if Ribera knows he's wrestling with that, but it seems to me that I think he's wrestling with that. He's wrestling with that when the colonial authority and the viceroy, the punchline is his granddaughter is raped by the viceroy in Spain, in Naples. So this is in terms of a kind of imbrication of the personal and the political. That's what interests me, is that imbrication of those categories within the mythology or legend of Bartholomew. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, Annika.
Thank you for this remarkable discussion. And I have a question that's arising from the chat, maybe a little bit more than the book itself, although now I'll turn to the book. I have a question about the status of the studio in the narrative, and it's partly because, Todd, you distinguished between the image and the picture, which, as I recall from earlier conversations with you, the picture participates in a picture trade. It has a kind of physical form that moves, that has to be stewarded. The image has a different status. But I'm curious how you think of Ribera's studio, what it offers or what it affords in terms of moving between something like an image or an actual picture. And our discussions about violence are thinking through the body of the plate or the body of the image as also being susceptible to incision and to these sorts of acts of violence. So I'd love to hear more about what the studio space allows. So for instance, here we know that Ribera goes back to an earlier print and draws it, right? That's part of this argument, and he maybe draws from a plate rather than the print since it's inverted, or, the kind of like, what happens when the works are in the studio? What is their status? How is Ribera actually negotiating that material presence in terms of your argument and your thinking about the movement of this imagery in the book?
Well, you noted, okay, I'll start off with the reversal, right? Which is, as part of the argument, is that he's actually working with a counterproof, which means the paper has no direct contact with the plate as such. It has contact with a wet print. So I use that to think about the process of distantiation from that kind of, this is kind of a false dichotomy here, this A before B, right, or B before A, right, that thing. So part of it might be that the studio provides the space in which these things can be recited, kind of recitation of this imagery. So what used to be like, or in other studios would be drawing as delegated to people around you. What you got in his studio is he's got a workshop. So he's got repetition, workshop, meaning distribution, chances of the stuff going to the colonies. Zurbaran, he made series of paintings that were intended to, like show the tribes of Israel for Mexican officials to identify the wandering Jew with the Mexicans, the Judeo-Mexicanos, that kind of thing. I don't know if that's, and no, Zubran's in another studio, but it's this pattern of repeating for studio production. So that's one answer: studio production, distribution. Ribera ends up selling all these plates to a printer in France, and he takes off with it. A whole family of people cut up the plates and start redistributing. So there's the sense of that workshop. It's partly that kind of distributed selfdom that can take place where, Svetlana years ago wrote about Rembrandt and his studio and the thing about the performance of the people in the studio and why are they performing to be mini Rembrandts, which is to say that is the goal of the artist, is not to produce singularity, but to produce a kind of extension of self.
But just unfortunately, we have to finish here. It's 1 o'clock. I was signaled, and I also have to go. But I don't want to interrupt. Yeah, it's that's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong. I was so. But there's a fascinating, just to conclude, but there's this interesting media critical side. You would call it also in what I retained, maybe exaggerated, but in the book, how you really draw attention to the instability of something that we think of as so stable in early modern. So they come up with these printing techniques, they produce these types, it's etching, it's repeated all the time, but also with the example with the mistake or with a mistaken moment or so, how Ribera seems to be deeply invested in that. I call it experimentation. I'm not sure with the craft on that level, and that really undermines what we often get the impression. It's such a stable medium. That
Latour, bless his soul, that essay he wrote is all William Evans at the Metropolitan Museum. It's all about repetition as continuity and immutability. Right? It's mobile, but it's immutable. And that's my emphasis, is the mutability and disintegration of the image or the picture. Sorry. So that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you guys for being here.